Okay, hello and welcome to this rehearsal of a presentation that I'm going to be giving in Connecticut. Going up for a brown bag presentation up there of some work that I have in progress. And this is actually, it's kind of nice. It's a work that I've been doing. Excuse me, it's work that I've had in progress for some number of years, and it stems from some of my earlier work, my deprioritizing the a priori arguments, deprioritizing the a priori arguments against physicalism. And so today I want to talk about how to defeat dualism. On another note, it's very nice just to be back here in Connecticut. I came to Connecticut in 2002 at UConn and was there until 2003. I left with a master's degree in philosophy and also just a very warm feeling towards Connecticut in general and UConn in particular. And so I think it's a great place to do philosophy, and I'm really looking forward to having a discussion and then also engaging with anyone who's interested. Now, just sort of to orient the project that I'm interested in, from my point of view, this is part of a larger project, which is exploring the possibility of what I call biologicalism about consciousness. And biologicalism is roughly the claim that consciousness is some kind of biological property. It could be like biological naturalism, if you're familiar with, for instance, Searle's view on this, so forth and so on. So in my particular case, I'm sympathetic to the type identity theory, and I don't think that's the only way to be a biologicalist. Um, there are other ways, but with respect to phenomenal consciousness, I want to not say that I think that the identity theory is true, but I would like to explore the options for saying that it's true. And the two main competitors here are obviously dualism, which is going to be what I'll talk about today, but then also what I call computationalism. Um, and these are two separate kinds of views. So computationalism probably is most familiar in the version of functionalism of some sort. And functionalism, says that's what the mind is when you implement these functions. And that's opposed to the identity theorist. But of course, you could also be a non-physicalist computationalist, and so those two could go together. And I sort of think that that's what David Chalmers' view is. He thinks that the non-physical properties, the qualitative properties, are connected by natural laws to computational states. So the two kinds of things are separate, but yet each of them poses a challenge to the idea that it's something distinctively biological, which matters for consciousness. And so today, what I want to be focusing on is on dualism, and I have other stuff I could talk about, which I think counts against computationalism in general. But for today, I just want to talk about: could it be something physical in general? Could consciousness be something physical? And so I want to focus on the 2D argument against dualism. And I think this argument is less known. More well known is the 2D argument against physicalism, and that's of which famous philosophical zombies play a role to make clear the possibility of zombie worlds where there's all of our physics and no consciousness. So I have proposed a parody argument, and other people have done this as well, so I'm not the only one. But there are people like Keith Frankish and Kadi Balog and others as well have pointed out that we can have an argument which has a similar structure. And so since I think there are subtle differences, and since I'm here talking for myself, I'll call these things shambis, although there is the possibility of some joint works in the future, so we may come to some agreement on terminology. So Keith would call them anti-zombies, and Kadi might call them Illuminati. And it doesn't really matter what word that you use them. What word you use to identify them. We hope we're talking about the same thing, which is creatures that are physically identical to you or I, so that they're completely physical, though, so they lack all non-physical properties, and yet they're conscious. And by conscious, I mean they have consciousness in the way that we do. So whatever way that we're conscious right now, when I experience a pain, my shambi twin has exactly that phenomenal qualitative aspect to his subjective inner mental life, and he lacks all non-physical properties. So he's just composed of physical properties. That's the shambi world. And if the shambi world is conceivable, then it's possible. And because of that, dualism is false. So that's the kind of argument that I wanted to press in 2010. And David Chalmers has responded to this, and we've had a lot of discussion about this, but here's what made it into his book, The Character of Consciousness, which came out in 2010, but it's a collection of papers and has some updated footnotes and so forth and so on. So in that paper, he assimilates this objection to the meta-modal objection from Stephen Yablo. So he says this is a closely related objection. The metamodal objection is the idea that you can conceive that God exists and you can conceive that God doesn't exist, but each of those is supposed to be a necessary truth. So the whole idea of using conceivability as a guide to what's possible is suspect. That's roughly Yablo's argument. And so Chalmers follows this idea and takes the shambi argument and related arguments to be targeting modal rationalism, or the very idea that you could go from conceivability to possibility. And he also construes it explicitly as invoking the conceivability of physicalism. So if you like the idea that physicalism can be characterized in this way, and I do, I'm perfectly happy for subjects of this debate at least to say that physicalism can be characterized as the claim that if you have our physics, then you can, a priori or necessitates the facts about consciousness. And so he construes the first premise of the shambi argument, as saying that that's possible. And so if you construe it that way, then you get the argument looking like this. That first thing is conceivable, and so it's possible. And if you invoke the modal logic S5, which has this axiom that if something is possibly necessary, then it is necessary, then it follows from the second premise up there that materialism or physicalism is true, that it's necessary, that if you have the physics, and it necessitates or entails the facts about consciousness. So this is the way he sets up the argument. And this is not the way that I, speaking for myself at least, want to set up the argument. And I don't think that the others who invoke this kind of argument intend to be invoking the possibility of a necessary truth here. At least not that, the idea is not that we are conceiving explicitly of physicalism being true. And that's one of the things that's wrong with this argument, the way that Chalmers is presenting it. The whole idea of the shambi argument is not to try to show that physicalism is true, but it's to try to show that dualism is false. So remember, it's supposed to be a parody argument of the zombie argument. The zombie argument is not trying to establish the truth of dualism so much as it is trying to show that physicalism is wrong, that it's not the case that something is. And that's what the shambi argument is doing. And also, as far as I'm concerned, the argument explicitly accepts the modal rational framework. So it accepts that conceivability is a guide to possibility. It accepts that what we mean by ideal is ideal conceivability, that we mean ideal negative conceivability for the most part. So the argument is not supposed to show that these two things are both seem conceivable, therefore suspect. The argument is supposed to show something else. And so it's worth getting clear on that. And so here's how the argument's supposed to go. So it's often, you start by formulating physicalism in terms of its modal implications. So it's often noticed that. But what's often overlooked here is that you can also formulate dualism in terms of its modal implications. So here you have to apologize for that tilde. I don't know why it's up there instead of where it's supposed to be in the in the middle. But anyway, what that sentence says is that it's not necessary that P entails Q. Um, and that says that physicalism is false. And that's why the possibility of P and not Q, P and tilde Q, puts pressure on physicalism. Because if you just use your straightforward rules of logic, you transform tilde box P horseshoe Q into that it's possible that P and not Q. So if that's really possible and you buy all this stuff, modal rationalism, then that does put pressure on physicalism. But now if you start from, so that's starting from the idea that physicalism is true. What if you started from the idea that dualism is true? Well, dualism is committed to the claim of whatever kind, and there are many different kinds, but dualism is committed to the claim that it's impossible that having just our physics results in consciousness. So what I mean by that is if you just specify the complete physical story about this actual world that we live in, and then you stipulated that that was all that there was in some possible world. So you just say, describe the physics, whatever it turns out to be, quantum mechanics, string theory, some kind of theory of quantum gravity, whether that's string theory or something else, who knows, but you have just that kind of stuff, special relativity, general relativity, quantum mechanics, and whatever deeper theory or whatever, and nothing else. If that's all you have in some possible world, then dualism is committed to the claim that there's no consciousness at that possible world. And so we can formulate dualism in this way. So if we sort of just follow David Chalmers' own work here, and we let T stand for that's all, so we call that a totality operator, and then we can just use PT to stand for P in normally standing for the description of a completed microphysics and fundamental particles and their relations, etc. And then you have the T, which is a totality operator, which says that's all. So if you have that expression, then this is what dualism says. It says that it's necessary that if all you have is our physics, then you don't have consciousness. Or alternatively, and this is saying the same thing, but just sort of emphasizing the consciousness bit, it says that it's necessarily the case that if you have consciousness, then you don't have just our physics. So dualism is committed to these claims right here, which are really the same claims. So that's, I think, what the thesis of dualism really is. Physicalism is committed to the necessity of P entailing Q, and dualism is committed to the necessity of consciousness, the existence of consciousness entailing that there's more than just our physics. And it's that idea that the shambi argument is trying to falsify. So the shambi argument is not trying to establish the truth of materialism or physicalism, but rather it's trying to show that dualism is false. So it's not trying to show that it's necessary that P entails Q. It's trying to show that it's not the case that it's necessary that just our physics entails a lack of consciousness. And applying the sort of straightforward rules of propositional logic, just again, what we're trying to show then is, since we're trying to show that it's not necessarily the case that PT entails not Q, what we need to show is that it's possible that you can have PT and Q. And so that's supposed to be the first premise of the shambi argument. It's not the thesis of materialism is conceivable, it's that PT and Q is conceivable. And PT and Q from that becomes possible. And from those two things, accepting modal rationalism, we show that it's false, that it's necessary that PT entails not Q. So what are we supposed to say about this totality operator here? Well, there are two things that we can say, and Chalmers in his own work has canvassed the various things we can say. So one we can say is that there's an implicit necessity operator, so that T really has to be cashed out as this expression here, which says for all R, if R, then it's necessary that if P, then R, and R here ranges over positive propositions, so the things which are positive truths, which can be stated in propositional format, And then this basically says for every positive truth, the completed physics entails that truth. So that's an implicit modal operator. Of course, then you could also say, well, T really just gives you all the fundamental properties. So it tells you that you have the completed physics and all the fundamental properties. And what you mean by fundamental, I don't know. Some people are suspicious of that. I think that either of these is fine. And that if you wanted to, you could understand the argument in this way. And in particular, I think it's fine as part of an argument that's parroting the original zombie argument, because the very idea of PT is invoked by Chalmers in his own work. And this here is where he's talking about the primary and secondary intention with respect to consciousness. So I think it's kind of at this point well known that he thinks primary and secondary intentions with respect to the terms in P can come apart. And that's the kind of idea behind Russellian monism, that you could have the primary intention, the thing that plays the mass role, and then the secondary intention is maybe consciousness here and nothing at the zombie world, according to him. So I think that's well known. But people often assume that the primary and secondary intention of terms like pain and consciousness have to coincide for the zombie argument to work. And Chalmers denies that. And one of the ways that he tries to show that is by showing that if you have a version of the argument which says PT and not Q, then you would still falsify physicalism, even though the primary and secondary intentions of Q come apart. Now, to me, that suggests that if he can appeal to the conceivability of this, and it doesn't invoke S5 or cause any problems with the argument, then we can appeal to the conceivability of PT and Q, and it doesn't invoke S5 or cause any problems with the argument. So I think you could basically stop at this point. Now, I would like to have there be no modal notions in the premises of the Shambi argument, and so I think that I would have a much weaker sense of what T is, and maybe this isn't a full understanding of that's all, but it certainly, I think, is enough to give you the Shambi argument. And so here's a sentence here. It says, for all x, if there exists a y such that y is identical to x, and that's roughly a way of saying that y exists. So that says, for all x, if y exists, then there is some z such that z is a physical property and z is identical to x. So to me, that's simply a way of saying in this world that we're talking about, you could, if there's something there that satisfies the antecedent of this conditional, so that there is a y and it's identical to x, then that thing is going to be some physical property, because that's all that there are. So there could be a complex, large physical property. It could be built up out of fundamental ones. It could be, I'm not specifying that, but this captures the idea that the things that you list off as existing in this world, if they do exist, then they are simply physical. So now that doesn't say anything about other possible worlds or what's necessary or what isn't necessary. It simply tells you that in this particular possible world, the things which exists are physical. Now, you might say, now wait a minute, you're just shuffling the identity operator over to the the necessity operator from T itself over to the identity statement that you had in the right-hand Stein over there. And I think, well, yeah, maybe not. So I think that there are non-modal axioms of identity. So that here's one, just says that for all x and all y, if x and y are identical, then if x has a property, then y has that property. So that's simply a way of saying that they share properties, that two things are identical. And that would be enough of a way to understand what it means to say that consciousness is physical at one particular world. Simply says, well, okay, if consciousness has this property, so does the brain state. And if the brain state has this property, so does consciousness. And there you go. Now, there's nothing there about modal notions. And that's all we need to say, is that this one world, all the properties are physical. And what we mean by that is that they all share these properties. If one thing has a property, so do the other. So it's all confined to one possible world. And it may be the case that you need to take all the kind of non-modal axioms, of which I was using that one as a kind of stand-in for them, and put a necessity operator on the front of it to fully understand identity. And Kripke famously gives his argument that identities are necessary if they're true at all, and that may be the case. But at least we can say that it's a debatable, contested claim, and so Quineans might reject it if they're sufficiently Quinean enough. Maybe even counterpart theorists will reject it, but of course they'll define identity relations in a way that, as it being a set of resembling objects, and I'm not really sure if that really is the same thing, but they certainly will try to capture ideas that X is the same across possible worlds, but we might debate about that. So whatever you say about those kinds of things, we can still conceive of the Shambi world. So a Quinean can conceive of the Shambi world, a Lewisian can conceive of the Shambi world. So I don't think there have to be any modal considerations in the argument at all. We simply say, well, you could have our physics and there could be nothing else at that world, and yet there's consciousness. That seems perfectly conceivable to me. So I think that this is important because it's sometimes thought, insofar as one accepts 2D semantics, one ought to be a dualist. It sort of just follows from that, unless you're an analytic functionalist like Jackson or something. But this, of course, depends on which of the pair, shambis or zombies, are ideally conceivable. And it's not clear which of those it is. Now, someone might say, well, I can conceive of them both. But Chalmers argues, well, look, and so the response that he gives here is ultimately saying whether the first premise is necessarily P horseshoe Q, or whether the first premise is P, T, and Q. Whatever the first premise is, Chalmers has said, zombies are conceivable. They're widely held to be conceivable, so it's not just Chalmers. But there also doesn't seem to be any contradiction in the idea there. And lots of people think they can conceive of zombies, and materialist and dualist alike, right? So there's type B physicalists. So he says, look, there you go. But then I think about this and I say, well, look, I just don't find zombies conceivable. I think I can conceive of the other things, shambis. And so now what are we supposed to do? Insofar as they both can't be ideally conceivable, what do? Well, Dave here leans on the claim that many people find it hard to see how consciousness could be physical. And this is what he says. He says, look, zombies just seem to be conceivable. Lots of people have had problems trying to understand what it would mean for consciousness to be physical. And so I think that's why zombies are conceivable. And if they are, then given modal rationalism, shambis are not conceivable. But that's too quick, because just as many people have found something like a shambi to be conceivable. And, go back to Democritus. Democritus thinks that the mind and what makes us human, the soul, whatever it is, the principle of motion that's internal to us is simply due to the shape of a certain atom. That's pretty materialist. And then, of course, there's Hobbes, and of course there are many others through history. And so I think if you cherry pick your examples like Descartes and a couple others, then yeah, of course it looks like people have had a very hard time understanding this. But you could cherry pick just as good examples on the other side of people who have said, well, it does at least seem conceivable. I mean, that's what it means to say I think the identity theory is true, is at least you're conceiving of it as being true. So I don't think that he gets any advantage here. Now also, he says, how could it be true? What are you conceiving of? I don't think that we need to know that in order to be able to conceive that it is true. I think that in this negative sense, what it means to conceive of it is to sort of notice that there's no contradiction entailed from entertaining it. So I think that's the sense in which zombies are said to be conceivable. There's nothing contradictory in the idea of all the physics there, but no consciousness. But there's nothing contradictory in the idea of all the physics there and just the physics and consciousness. So I think that someone needs to show where the contradiction is. Um, and given the two-dimensional framework, which I'm accepting, only one of them is really conceivable at the limit. But given that there is reasonable disagreement, and no one has yet shown where the contradiction comes from. So if you could be a dualist and say, look, the physical theory entails this contradiction, and it doesn't mention zombies or inverts or anything that's related in that way, then that would be a victory. On the other hand, if the physicalists could come along and say, here's the contradiction entailed by dualism, and they don't mention conceivability, shambis, etc., or denying modal rationalism or anything like that, if you could do that, then the a priori methodology would really be mattering or helping. But we can't do that, or no one has done it yet, because there's nothing contradictory in either notion. And so that's why some people find shambis conceivable and others find zombies conceivable and others find both of them conceivable. And so the argument here is not that modal rationalism is false, but that even if it were true, conceiving of zombies for us without knowing what's contradictory about the opposing view and really being able to say why it's false, it's just tracking what theory seems true already to us. Or in other words, we need to downgrade, or what I have said called deprioritize, a priori arguments on either side. All right, thank you very much.